Welcome back to The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Callistra Faria. Joining me now on the program is Dr. David HINDS. He's a professor, political scientist, and a cultural activist. He is from Guyana. He's joining me to take a look at the recent developments of the United States seeking to increase its military presence in the Caribbean. The reason being given by the United States is increased drug interdiction activities that is being taken with a pound of salt, as we say in the Caribbean. That reason and all eyes looking at the United States posturing towards Venezuela. A recent ask of Grenada that the United States house a military radar base at the country's international airport, the Maurice Bishop International Airport. That has met with a lot of pushback from Grenadians, and the Caribbean is watching this development, looking at what it means in the wider context of the Caribbean as a zone of peace, of CARICOM, Caribbean unity, and the position that Grenada could place itself in, no matter what it says to the United States. Dr. HINDS helps me to break down those issues right now. Dr. HINDS, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Callistra, and it's my pleasure to be with you. I am a long-standing viewer of your program, and I'm here.
Thank you so much. And the Caribbean, we haven't had this much activity in the Caribbean for a while. Such intense activity in the Southern Caribbean, English speaking, for a while. But we're seeing things sort of heating up now. The U.S. has requested, as you know, that. Of Grenada to install a military radar base at the Maurice Bishop International Airport. The Grenada government sending out a statement a few days ago saying that they are carefully considering the request. No yes, no no, but that they're considering. We have not yet heard again from the Grenada government, and I'm guessing that the diplomatic footwork is happening as we speak. But what would such a presence mean for Grenada's sovereignty and neutrality? A military radar base at Port Salines on Grenada's sovereign soil?
Well, it will mean a lot, uh, but it would be deja vu all over again, to borrow a quotation from Fannie Lou Hamer um, in the United States of America during the Civil Rights Movement. I want to preface what I'm going to say by quoting from David Rudder's classic Calypso 1990, which he wrote and sang in 1989. Um, and the refrain in that calypso is that the more things change, rearrange, everything remains
Yes.
the same. And David Rudder is singing, philosophizing about our Caribbean state 35 years ago. And here we are again after the New World Order that was promulgated after the Second World War, when the victors of that war met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and came up with the New World Order, what is called the Washington Consensus. At that time, Grenada and the English speaking Caribbean did not exist as sovereign countries. We were still colonies. And so we entered a world that was not created for us. And we have had to grapple with that world ever since. We grappled with that world during the Cold War. There were some devastating consequences for our region during that time. Grenada, of course, was at the center of that beginning in 1979. And of course, 1983, we had the US landing troops in Grenada and so forth. Um, and so we come to this new era where we are seeing a new world order replacing the old Bretton Woods Washington consensus, a new Washington consensus being promulgated by President Trump, which in effect is an updating of the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, which reserves for the United States the right to intervene in its in the southern hemisphere, in the Americas. And we have seen the updating of that Monroe Doctrine. The latest was under Reagan, and now we have Trump updating that that um, uh, uh, consensus, if you will. And so here we are, as English speaking Caribbean, as English speaking Caribbean, the old West Indies, having to once again turn our gaze to a world that obviously was not made for us, that doesn't care about us and in a real fundamental way, except when we are there to serve the interests of foreign forces. And how cruel it is that 63 years after the first countries got independence, won independence, 1962, Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, and the rest of us followed. Here we are, 60 odd years, the cruel irony that we are called upon to bear the burden of the interests of larger countries, and especially cruel to a place like Grenada that has seen in a direct way what the power of external forces can do against the will of a people. And to ask a small country of barely 100,000 people, small in terms of size, small in terms of its economic base, to ask that country to serve as a medium for the interests of large countries in a dramatic military way, I think is something that is very difficult for the Caribbean to deal with. But the fact of the matter is that here we are, geographically located in a space that has become our contestation of first world politics. We have China, which has a heavy footing in Latin America and the Caribbean economically. We have Russia with its relationship with Venezuela, and we have the United States. And what we are seeing here is the makings of a geopolitical war, and we are caught in the middle.
And how do we, given the position, you said it, Grenada, small economically, small in size, in and how do we respond with the level of dependence under which we exist? How do we exercise our sovereignty in a matter like this? How do we say no when the largest and some say the strongest country on earth comes knocking and says, I need to use you for my own expedience? What what do you say? I mean, how does this development affect Grenada's diplomatic balance between the United States and Venezuela? We have had tremendously good ties with Venezuela over the years. So both nations, we've had ties with them. And we've maintained cordial relations. What happens now?
You know, Calistro, there has been a debate in Caribbean academic circles, Caribbean study circle. It was raging about a decade ago. I know your own Dr. Wendy Grenade and myself and others were involved in that debate. Do countries like Grenada and the rest of the Anglophone Caribbean, do we really have sovereignty? Are we really sovereign states? And there was a very strong view among seasoned Caribbean academics that at the end of the day, we don't have sovereignty in the strictest sense of the term. And I remember Professor Grenade and myself and other younger scholars at that time really pushing back, because we came up in an era where we took Caribbean sovereignty for granted. Our economic sovereignty may be in question because of the size of our economy. But in terms of political sovereignty and cultural sovereignty, we always thought that that meant something. And the older scholars or the more seasoned scholars were arguing that no, we don't have the kind of sovereignty. And that debate went on for a little while. And I suppose it's still there. The question is, that is the fundamental question here. In the strictest sense of international relations, is Grenada and the Caribbean, are we sovereign states? And I think the question is that we are sovereign on paper, we are sovereign in theory, but in practice, most of the time, we are not sovereign. And this is a time when that fragile sovereignty that Professor Grenade and others like myself talked about, that fragile sovereignty is now being tested in a most brutal way. Because to ask a question of Grenada, um, can I put military equipment in your country, is really to put Grenada between a rock and a hard place or two hard places. Because if Grenada were to say yes, then it would be violating its own principles, starting with emancipation in 1838, coming through to independence in the mid 20th century, and coming forward, that we have always fought for a widening of the sovereignty space. And if we were to say yes, we would be violating that long struggle for sovereignty. And if we say no, then we put ourselves, small nations, put ourselves on the chopping block, because clearly the United States and other large countries have the wherewithal to beat us into submission. I am sure that Grenadians do not want to revisit the outcome of the 1979-83 revolution and the way in which geopolitical forces intervened. I am very sure of that. I'm very sure that the masses of people in the English speaking Caribbean do not want to go back there. So if Grenada were to say yes, it would violate everything that independence means and freedom means for small post plantation societies that have for 400 years struggled for some breathing space in a very harsh world. And if we were to say no, if Grenada were to say no, I repeat, it does not have the leverage to beat back the United States of America, which will surely directly and indirectly retaliate. And it can do so with the click of a finger. We still do not trade as much with ourselves in the Caribbean. A lot of our trade is with outside of the Caribbean. Grenada will be affected the next day economically if the United States were to retaliate, and I'm sure they would retaliate. There is evidence of that.
Well,
In the
I mean,
1970s, yeah, go ahead.
they've already been, Dr. Hines, they've already been setting the stage somewhat. There's that ban hanging over our heads regarding the export of tuna to the United States.
Yes,
And the visa of our Minister of Finance was pulled a few weeks ago. So there's already been that buildup of what some believe is intimidatory tactics by the United States that has led to this point and has led to this request. But not only does it only create problems for us with the United States and the fact that it can use a fraction of its might against us and sort of swat us away, or do we also see a problem between Grenada and Venezuela? Should we allow military assets to be placed at Port Salines? Does that immediately place us as an enemy of Venezuela, given the dynamics between Venezuela and the United States at the moment?
the short answer to your question is yes. And we take the example of Guyana, which is next door to Venezuela. And Venezuela said that if the United States were to attack them, they will attack Guyana. And as we know, there is a historical border problem between Guyana and Venezuela. And Venezuela said very plainly they will militarily attack Guyana if the United States were to attack them. And so, should Grenada say yes, Grenada then risks being put in the same category where the Venezuelans would say, we will attack you militarily if you concede to the United States request. So it's really is an untenable situation. And I am arguing that mature countries such as the United States ought to find some way to conduct their foreign policy without putting countries like Grenada, small states that don't trouble the world. There is a song in Guyana, I'm not a blade of grass, we don't look for trouble. We in the Caribbean don't look for trouble. We survive. We have always survived in a harsh world. And so I'm saying foreign policy, international relations can be conducted in a way not to put a small country like Grenada on the spot. Grenada doesn't deserve that. None of the English speaking countries deserves it. We are already on thin ice because Venezuela has been good to Grenada. It has been good to countries in the English speaking Caribbean. And so now you put Grenada in on that spot, I think is harsh. But if you say yes, you're in trouble because what do you stand for as a country, as a civilization? If you say yes, if you say no, then you are exposed not just to retaliation from the United States of America, but as you correctly point out, you are then become an enemy of Venezuela and subject to Venezuela's long arms in retaliation for what the United States may or may not do to them.
Now, Dr. Hines, there are some, a few in Grenada at least, who argue that uh, even former parliamentarians in our country saying that Grenada, this is an opportunity for Grenada to negotiate with the United States to do a quid pro quo kind of arrangement. You can put your military assets here, but Grenada wants this and Grenada wants that, issues with visas, and they've outlined a wish list, some those who are taking that position. Any merit in that? Is that an out for Grenada?
Yeah,
That damn if you don't, so you might as well get something out of it. Is what some are pushing. A small amount of people, mind you, but some anyhow.
yes, there has to be merit in that. Now, I was on a program, I think 2 days ago or 3 days ago, on the weekend, in Antigua and Barbuda radio station there, and the issue came up, and I said, at an ideological level, I do not believe in transactional politics, especially when it comes to your sovereignty and the principle in which your nation stands. And so I don't believe in transactional politics. But I'm cognizant of the fact that the world has moved in that direction where transnational politics is now more the norm than it was 40 years ago. In our own Caribbean, if you look at the base of our society, we have a new individualism that is slowly replacing the national ethos which we have which we have become accustomed to in our Caribbean. It's now people are beginning to make a choice between individualism and the nation. And so there is now more of an appetite for transaction than you had 30 years ago, 40 years. And as political commentators and political thinkers and observers, we have to take note of that. And so, as a last resort, not a first resort, as a last resort, I would be forced to go against my own abhorrence of transactional politics to say, if you're gonna beat me on my head and tell me that I got to do this, at least let's negotiate and see where you can soften some of what you are about to do and where you can compensate Grenadians and by extension Caribbean people for what you're going to do. Now, I don't know what that looks like. I don't have a wish list. I haven't seen the wish list from the Grenadian group. But I'm sure that we can come up with any number of wish lists. We have issues of poverty which stalks the Caribbean. And if we can negotiate an end to poverty, that may be something that is worth going after. But at the end of the day, it has to be on both sides. The transaction, if I were to advise, I would say the transaction has to do with the Americans and others doing something fundamental to alter excuse me, to alter life in the Caribbean, but also to do something to soften the blow that putting military equipment in Grenada would do to Grenada in the long term. Because you see, this is not just the near term, this is about the long term. Often, when big countries have a military foothold, they don't leave. They don't leave, and that is going to become, after Venezuela is gone and President Trump is gone and so on, those troops will be there. Could we, could Grenada ask for a removal of whatever hardware will be put there within a certain timeline? I don't know. I don't know what it will look like. But as I said, transactional politics is part of local politics, global politics, international politics, and it should not be taken off the table.
And this week we have, we got information here at a WPG10 and Carib update that the United States is even sending a senior military official, an admiral, to hold talks in St. George's. So they are definitely determined to do this. What do you think is likely the strategic motivations behind Washington's interest in establishing a base in Grenada in particular? One of the smallest of our group. I mean, they've already got Trinidad. Why do you think they would want a foothold here in Grenada, or eyes, if you
Well,
will, out of St. George's?
Grenada is familiar territory. I mean, the Americans intervened in Grenada in 1983. And so Grenada is familiar territory. And there may be the misunderstanding of where the Grenadian masses stand on this issue. We in the Caribbean have a way. We have a saying here in Guyana, where Guinea border holla, not there you lay. And sometimes when we exhibit certain political behaviors, people take it at face value. So I think there is a view in the North that anti imperialism as an ideological and national response to the world is not as strong as it used to be 40 years ago. There may be some truth in that. But it does not mean that the people, because anti imperialism is not something that they hold in their fist every day, that they do not have nationalist sentiment. And they may not be as anti-imperialist as they were 40, but they are proud to be Grenadians, and they will take, and they must take, because they're human beings, take affront to a country just come in and say, we want to put up this thing here, and that's that, and so on. You are going to get some kind of national response. It's natural and normal for that kind of response. And so I think there may be the misplaced view that Grenada is going to be an easy walkover, because as we know, the population had two responses in 1983. One was that we don't necessarily like foreign countries coming on our shores, but there was a strong response that the government of the day was quote unquote authoritarian, and so we welcome the Americans. Sometimes that dual response by our people is misunderstood. And so if you're American military historian, you may think, well, I have Trinidad, and I think they have Guyana, because although the Guyanese government has not come out and say anything definitive, those of us who are familiar with Guyanese politics know that Guyana will fall in line. So you have Trinidad and you have a Guyana. And if you look around at the countries in the Eastern Caribbean that are geographically in proximity to Venezuela, there is Grenada. And then you say, well, yeah, we were there before. They welcomed us, quote unquote, and maybe we are not going to get as much resistance in Grenada as in other places.
The invasion was as successful as it was because Morris Bishop was not there. That was why
Yeah,
there was this dual response to it,
yeah,
or else
right.
the welcoming might have been a much more lukewarm affair. Um, does this move by Washington to increase its military presence, as you said, they've got Guyana. We understand why Guyana goes where America goes, given their boundary issues with Venezuela, Venezuela threatening to take a whole chunk of, claiming a whole chunk of Guyana. Trinidad, well, who knows what's going on there, because they have so many domestic issues that they may feel they need outside help. And now Grenada. Does this move signal a fragmentation of the Caribbean's traditional stance as a zone of peace, or does fragmentation go too far?
Yes, and at the end of the day, that is going to be the big issue for us in the Caribbean, because as small nation states, whenever we have won anything big, it has always been as a collective. We won emancipation in 1838 as the Caribbean, as the what later became known as the Anglophone Caribbean. We won independence as a collective, although we got it at different times and so forth, different years. It was an anti-colonial struggle that had its root in Caribbean labor. Your own Marichaud and others, the barefoot labor leaders, played a very important role in ushering the 1930s, what they call the decade of the 1930s riots, which was really the last mass push for independence from Jamaica and the Bahamas in the north, right down to Grenada, Trinidad, and Guyana in the south. We have always, when we move purposely, we have always moved as a region. And after 60 odd years, that is still true. That when we have defended ourselves, when we have protected our rights, when we have won chunks of freedom, we have done so as a collective. And there are times when we have been divided because the logic of the nation state really brings brings that integration ethos into collision with the nation state. But we have always survived it. My sense is that if we were to be divided on this issue, it will take a long time to stitch back the Caribbean integration, which really has been our bedrock since independence. You know, we 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 don't have leverage, and that's what is seen here. You take a Guyana, for example. Some of us are arguing that there are 30 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Some are saying it's around 20. Whatever it is, we have enough wealth in Guyana coming from oil to be used as leverage on in international relations. So while we may have the economic base to do so, we don't necessarily have the political will. So since the end of the Cold War, and we have been consumed with our internal politics, our politics in St. Lucia and Grenada and Barbados and Guyana and so on. The world has moved on. Superpowers are there because they are powerful, and they will always make moves like the ones that is being made now. Now, we in the Caribbean are never going to be able to stop them from making those moves. But one thing we could do is that over time, build up some leverage so that when this time comes, we are prepared and we are able to go to the table and use some leverage to protect ourselves and to save our people from becoming embroiled in an overt way in international politics. I have to say that we are guilty over the last 30 years of turning inwards without not keeping an eye on what's happening in international politics. And we are caught, as they say here, with our proverbial skirt or pants or whatever done. That here we are, faced again with the imperative of big country politics. We are in the crossfire, and we are not able in a really formidable way as a region to at least say, hold on, not so fast, not like this. Let's sit at the table and say something. You know, it's one of the things that we have to take from the page of the Cubans, who sometimes, because of political reasons, ideology, international, we don't learn the lessons there. But Cuba's always been able to say, oh no, not so fast. Now they've suffered immensely because of it. But at least one of the things that you do as a small state is your ability not to stop the barrage, but to say, not so fast and not straight at us. You can go wrong so. And we in the English speaking Caribbean, I don't think that we are at that point. No.
Let me ask you though, and it's interesting that you say you don't think we're at that point now, because I was about to ask you, what role should CARICOM play in navigating these geopolitical tensions to protect regional sovereignty? You said, are we really sovereign? Um, are we in a position where we have sufficient leverage to push back as a grouping? But still, what role can CARICOM play here?
I think CARICOM can play a role in protecting Grenada because Grenada needs protection. Grenada should not sit at that table with the Americans by itself. Now it's a sovereign nation and it has a right to sit there by itself. But I think we have to have what I would refer to as levels of negotiation. That Grenada obviously has the first and the last say. But I think CARICOM should sit at the table with Grenada and argue that this is not just a Grenada issue. This is an hemispheric issue that is going to have consequences for the rest of us in the Caribbean. And it will. Because if Grenada were to say yes, you would be bringing the American military in an overt way into the Caribbean. We have been through that before when we saw the Eugenia Charles and Tom Adams
Tom
of this
Adams.
world sat there and invited the Americans to come in to the Caribbean. And here we are again. Grenada would be saddled with that guilt were it to say yes. And so I am arguing that it should be a Grenada approach plus a Caribbean CARICOM approach, so that whatever negatives that come, we all share responsibility for it. If there are any little positives, that we all share responsibility for it. I always believe at the end of the day, we are what the mighty chalk does say, seawater and sand. And no disrespect to God has blessed us with seawater and sand. Seawater and sand has given us a living. But compared with the might of the United States and the European countries and other first world countries, our seawater and sand is not going to be able to give us the kind of leverage that we need. And so if we were to collectively bring all that seawater and sand together in one collective and said, this is all we have. All we have is ourselves. All we have are these outposts, post plantation outposts, but very important in terms of world civilization. And we do not want to have to fetch the burden of the first world countries. And I'm not saying that we should beg. Certainly, we should plead. We're not going to be able to demand, but certainly we must be able to put some cards on the table as a collective.
And finally, let me ask you, Dr. Hines. Some believe it's a pretext for regime change in Venezuela, but that all of the claims of the United States and the pronouncements of the United States about drug interdiction in the Caribbean is what all of this heightened military presence, including nuclear submarines, is for. But we do have arrangements that would allow drug interdiction without the United States ever asking to ask Grenada to place military radar at its international airport. We do have something called the Shipwriters Agreement that facilitates any kind of drug interdiction activity that should take place in the Southern Caribbean, don't we?
You're quite correct. And the shipwriters' agreement, most recent convert, was Guyana, which signed on in 2020. So the shipwriter is alive and well. And the shipwriters' agreement more than give the United States the power to fight drugs in the Caribbean. In fact, at the time of the shipwriters' agreement, some of us took a strong stand against it, primarily because the United States was going to be responsible for into of stopping drug shipments and so forth. But the liabilities would be for the Caribbean countries. So if property is destroyed in the process of these ships interdicting drug shipments and so forth, then the liabilities would be for the Caribbean. And a lot of us oppose the shipwriters agreement on that score. But it's there. The shipwriters agreement is there, and it's a potent weapon if the United States wants to use it. And the United States did use the shipwriter agreement to its optimum at least up to about 10 years ago. So there's there. So for me, there is no doubt in my mind, and should be no doubt in the mind of Caribbean people, that this is the pretext for political outcomes. This is the pretext for regime change in Venezuela. But more than regime change in Venezuela, it's a way of saying to Latin America and the Caribbean, don't go the Venezuela way. At the end of the Grenadian Revolution in 1983, in the wake of the demise of that revolution with American might, it was clear, the Americans made it clear, revolution is over in this part of the world. And they impose that on our Caribbean. And so while it may be, and it is from my standpoint, definitely a pretext to take care of what's happening there in Venezuela. The fact of the matter is that it's also a warning to the rest of the Caribbean: stay in your lane, as the young people would say. Stay in your lane. Don't get out of line. So it's Venezuela, but it's also the rest of us. As I said, as small states, we do not need to be in the midst of big people, big state war. Let them fight their wars and keep us out of it. Keep us out of it, because we don't trouble nobody. All we do is try to survive in a world that don't need islands no more. Only when it's time to make big geopolitical push that these islands become prominent again.
So what we're seeing here as we close the Dr. Hines, is that with the growing Chinese and Russian influence in the region, as you mentioned earlier, through trade and diplomacy and things like that, the U.S. action is nothing more than a countermeasure to those relationships and what they mean geopolitically, and the position that Venezuela is in. So this is what basically it's about. It's really not about blowing up little fishing boats, carrying drugs or not carrying drugs.
You're quite correct. The demand for drugs is in the north. The supplier of drugs is to the south of us. We don't supply no drugs to the United States in the English speaking Caribbean. We don't produce drugs here in the English speaking Caribbean. We just happen to be geographically in the middle, and we are caught up in
As
the United
transshipment points. But studies,
transshipment point.
there are some reports that do not list Venezuela as a narco state, as a narco producing state as well. There's also that.
There you go. There you go. And the Chinese came into the Caribbean when the United States, ill advisedly, as some will argue, turned its gaze and its eyes away from the Caribbean and went into other parts of the world, such as the Middle East, where they felt their interests would be better served. And as that's politics, as they turned their gaze, the Chinese moved in. And so now, to make us suffer because of a political move that you made, I think is the unkindest cut. We did not send for the Chinese. In the same way, we didn't send for the Americans. We didn't send for Columbus. They came, they conquered, we survived, and we continue to survive. And the Chinese and the Russians or whoever moving in is as a function of politics outside of our realm, outside of our purview. And so, therefore, that we should have to suffer, that Grenada should have to make this choice one way or the other is unkind.
Dr. Hines, I want to thank you so much for joining me here on The Narrative to discuss this very important and developing story. We look forward to having you back on The Narrative sometime soon. Thank you so much, sir.
And thank you very much for having me. It's always my pleasure. Not often do I get to raise my Caribbean fist, so to speak, which is always there. Thank God He gave us so many identities in the Caribbean. We're Grenadian, we're African, we are, Native Indian, we are East Indian, Asian East Indian, but we are always Caribbean. We are always, because the Caribbean was there before Grenada and St. Lucia and Guyana and all the new nation states. And so it's always my pleasure to turn my eye and to turn my mind towards Caribbean issues.
Thank you very much, sir. This is The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Callistra Faria. That was Dr. David Hines of Guyana, political scientist and activist, speaking about the U.S. Seeking to increase its military presence in the Caribbean, the geopolitical dynamics and implications at play, and a request of Grenada to host a military radar base at Point Elizabeth International Airport. And in the month of October, of all months, the anniversary of the invasion of Grenada by the United States in 1983. This is The Narrative. More when we come back.